Okay, we're going to make a start. As usual, we will see people trickling in as we go along. So this is why I'm going to just set the scene with a few introductory slides, so allowing a few more people to join us for the first talk. So I suppose delusions, certainly a fascinating topic that has occupied professionals and lay people likewise. It sits kind of at the center really of psychiatry as a medical discipline, trying to differentiate almost between what is healthy and what is ill. And I think that the term is often confusing and contradictory, as represented in this wonderful quote from George Orwell: in general, the greater the understanding, the greater the delusion. The more intelligent, the less sane. Well, I'll leave it to you to make sense really of that particular statement. I think from perspective of psychiatry, despite our best efforts, we do have difficulties in terms of having a reliable and valid definition of delusions. I mean, just take the firmly held false belief that persists despite evidence to the contrary, still a rather difficult category for our psychopathological definitions. We have other problems that we are still dealing with. For example, it is well known that delusional disorders by and large are commonly difficult to treat, at least considered difficult to treat. This quote from the British Journal of Psychiatry points towards the fact that there's a lot of unsubstantiated speculation when it comes to talking about delusion in a scientific sense. And schizophrenia bulletin last year, there is still much more to learn about paranoia and how much and much work remaining to translate and implement these advances into mental health services. So delusion in society, one of the topics of this afternoon. It is clearly a culture-bound personal issue when we talk about the question as to whether a particular belief is culture-bound or actually justified in a given context. And I suppose at a time when the social media is sort of flooded with opinions about all sorts of matters where we have confusion between facts and opinions, it's really worthwhile unpicking the term delusion as well in that particular context. So I think what we need to do is we need to listen to the experts. And I'm really pleased that we have an amazing lineup of speakers this afternoon. And it's on purpose that we're trying to actually bring different perspectives really to the topic of delusion, from phenomenology to neuroscience. And I'm hoping that we will have some lively and interesting debates, really trying to reconcile the different perspectives towards the topic of delusions. So on that very note, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Thomas Fuchs from Heidelberg. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Thomas for 20 odd years on and off, and Thomas has always been a tremendous source of inspiration, really, because he's one of the very few academics who've been spreading really from philosophy, psychiatry, neuroscience, and try to conceptualize those various perspectives. Now, Thomas has a unique position as the Karl Jaspers Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry. I don't think there's any other of that kind anywhere in Europe, in Heidelberg. And he's head of the Department of General Psychiatry. He coordinates the Marsilius Project Embodiment as Paradigm of New Evolutionary Cultural Anthropology. And he heads the Research Center for the Karl Jaspers edition. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Psychopathology. And his main areas of research include phenomenological philosophy and psychopathology, embodied and enactive cognitive science, and interactive concepts of social cognition. His clinical work focuses on psychopathology and psychotherapy of affective and schizophrenic disorders. Thomas seems to have at least a 36-hour day, according to the range of publications that pop out every month. And I highly recommend his 2017 book with the title Ecology of the Brain, the Phenomenology and Biology of the Embodied Mind. And I think Thomas is very well placed to talk about delusion, reality, and intersubjective perspectives towards our theme today. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for the kind invitation to this afternoon. I'm glad to be with you, and I'll start right away with my topic, delusion, reality, and intersubjectivity. Well, the current dominant psychiatric paradigm is based on the conception of the patient as an individual with a more or less clearly defined brain dysfunction. On this view, delusions seem to be the product of faulty information processing in the brain. After all, delusions misrepresent reality, so they must somehow be in the head, usually being defined as false personal beliefs about external reality. Now, in what follows, I will challenge this view and argue that delusion should rather be seen as an intersubjective phenomenon, and namely on two levels. First, delusions manifest themselves primarily as failures of communication. So while interacting with the patient, one realizes that it is not possible to arrive at a shared definition of the situation through usual giving and taking of reasons, through usual mutual perspective taking. And second, on a deeper level, delusions may be regarded as a failure to co-constitute reality. That's a complicated phenomenological term, and I'm here also as a phenomenological psychopathologist. I hope it becomes clear what is meant in what follows. In any case, it should be regarded as a disturbance of implicit intersubjectivity. So what we presuppose as being as sharing a shared reality. So in order to develop such an intersubjective account of delusion, I will first, in what follows, give an account of the constitution of reality through what I call inactive perception, then the co-constitution of reality through implicit intersubjectivity, or also what is called in philosophy transcendental intersubjectivity, so the condition for us to share a common reality. And on this account, I will look at the disturbance of reality constitution in schizophrenic delusion, not in every delusion, but focusing on schizophrenic delusion. Now, starting with the constitution of reality in our everyday experience, again, the standard account of delusions regards them as mistaken beliefs about objective facts in the world. So the underlying assumption is that there is something like an object, like an external reality, which is given as such, and which is only given to us through representations in our mind. This is the fundamental assumption of internal representations, given through representations, as I said, and this is challenged by the inactive approach to cognition. According to this approach, reality is not something predetermined and external, but it is continuously constituted by a living being's sensory-motor interaction with the environment. So organisms do not passively receive information and perception from outside. Rather, they interact with the environment, and that is how they constitute, how they create, so to speak, reality. And in the case of humans, this includes the constitution of a shared reality, and this is the case through social interactions. Now, the question could be, if the world is constituted for us through interactive sense-making, then we are in a sense entangled with the world all the time. And now one could ask, how is the objectivity of perception possible? Perception which, after all, presents the objects to us as such, the objects themselves. And an essential presupposition for the objectivity of perception is the constant shifting of perspective through self-movement, moving around an object, grasping it, turning it, and so on. Because this creates changes and contrasts, depending on one's own action. Now, importantly, this skilled sensory-motor interaction with the environment over time becomes part of one's bodily habits, habitual knowledge, and therefore one's bodily anticipations. So what the environment enables and affords, how it changes according to our actions, is already anticipated in our perception. It is appresented, as Edmund Husserl called it. Therefore, my experience of the reality of an object depends on a horizon of possible further experience that I will have with this object, a horizon that is derived from my former interactions, dealings with this object. Object permanence, as acquired through sensory-motor interaction in early childhood, is a crucial part of this. So we assume that the objects will also continue to exist during our absence. Now, as we have seen, perception doesn't present images or appearances, but the full objects, because perception is part of our embodied engagement with the world. However, there's still another level of objectivity, which is characteristic of human perception. In perceiving an object such as a house, we experience it also as independent of our own present perception. So objects are not only there for me, so in the immanence of my subjectivity, but they are given as such. At least Berkeley's essays percipi, so to be is to be perceived, certainly doesn't correspond to our experience of perception. For nobody would get the idea that the objects only emerged if I look at them, are dependent on my perception, and without being perceived, they would disappear into nothingness. Now, how is this independence possible? Husserl's later answer to this question referred to the intersubjectivity of perception. So the house that I see is also a possible object for others who could see it simultaneously from other sides. Husserl also speaks of a perceptive horizon of possible experiences, my own and those of others, and this is what turns the mere subjectivity of my experience into what he calls an open intersubjectivity. So in perceiving, we always enact, that's wrongly spelled here, enact, it should be an E, and inhabit a space that we share with others. More fundamentally, objectivity depends on the transcending of my private sphere of subjectivity, and this primarily occurs in the encounter with the other. The other is always beyond my pure immanence, my own subjective sphere, and this otherness of the other is also on which this otherness of the other is what grounds my experience of objectivity. Indeed, it grounds my perceptual faith in a world that exists independent of my own perception. So one could say that even Robinson Crusoe on his island saw it always with others' eyes, even before any other human stepped on this island. Now, in active terms, this implicit, or also what we can call transcendental intersubjectivity, may be interpreted as resulting from a shared history of participatory sense-making. From birth on, the presence and the meaning of objects are continuously established through our social interactions, particularly including situations of joint attention, joint practices of coping with the world. So we have learned to perceptually distinguish, to recognize, to handle objects by witnessing how others relate to them. On this level of reality constitution, the equivalent to the self-referential movement, bodily movement and contrast of viewpoints, which I've mentioned on the first level, the equivalent is social perspective taking, seeing the world with others' eyes. This extends the bodily self-movement by adopting virtual perspectives and thus multiplies the possibilities of contrasting. And this is what suspends the individual's primary self-centrality and enables perspectival flexibility. Intersubjectivity in its full sense is thus based on the capacity to oscillate between one's own egocentric perspective and an allocentric or decentered perspective. And this is a capacity that the German philosopher Helmut Plessner has called the eccentric position, a higher level stance from which we can compare our own and the other's point of view. Now, besides the capacity for perspective taking, there's still another essential presupposition for a shared reality, namely an implicit or taken for granted background to all our social interaction. It consists of the fundamental assumptions, the axioms of everyday life, as Erwin Strauss has called them, or the unquestioned bedrock certainties of Ludwig Wittgenstein. These certainties are shared by the members of a culture without necessarily being made explicit or verbalized. Common sense may be regarded as an expression of those basic certainties, but it also includes shared habits, forms of interaction that are embodied in the process of socialization. In the affective dimension, this background corresponds to a basic trust in the world and in others. That also develops from infancy through the interaction with the caregivers. So the co-constitution of a shared reality crucially depends on this habitual pre-reflective background. Let me summarize these considerations. Perception transcends the centrality of subjective perspective by a decentering that happens on two interrelated levels. On the first level, the sensorimotor interaction with the environment implies a mobility of perspectives that relativizes the momentary coupling or relation of organism and environment. And on the second level, the social interaction with others implies a kind of virtual shifting and contrast of perspectives, which helps to overcome a merely subject-centered worldview. And on both levels, the individual's history of interactions is sedimented in his or her implicit memory, resulting in two fundamental habitual structures. On the first level, it means the body's capacity of skillfully coping and on the capacity of familiarity with the world. And on the second level, early socialization establishes the habitual structure of being with others, which manifests itself in an implicit or open intersubjectivity. In some, human reality is always co-constituted, or a kind of artificial term, inter-enacted. Now, on this basis, let me look at schizophrenic delusion as disturbance of reality constitution. And I will start my analysis by looking at a characteristic phenomenon that you all know, the phenomenon at the beginning of schizophrenic psychosis, which amounts to a radical subjectivation of perception. And as is well known, in the pre-delusional atmosphere, or delusional mood, as Karl Jaspers has called it, the patients experience the surroundings as strangely unreal, as if they were seeing only artificial images instead of real objects. Objects look spurious, somehow manufactured, contrived. It all feels like being in the center of an uncanny staging. I give two examples for this. Wherever you're looking, everything already appears unreal. The whole environment, everything becomes strange, and you get terribly frightened. Somehow everything is suddenly there for me, like being arranged for me. Everything around you suddenly refers to you, like you're in the center of a plot, like in a scenery. Or Everything feels oppressive. Take this table or these walls, they are strange. I guess everything looks phony. But it's not only here. The walls in my living room also feel paper-like, as if I was in a set. Patients themselves often call these experiences Truman Show or Matrix symptoms, and they point to a radical change of the structure of perception. One could say that the intentional field that is normally directed towards the object is reversed. Formerly, the objects kept their distance, their neutrality, but now they start to refer to the patient, to approach him in an uncanny and oppressive way. Perception, one could say, no longer grasps the objects as such in the distance as they are, but only presents the appearances for me. And perception has lost its intentional, its decentering structure. And this is precisely why the patient becomes the center of the world. Not infrequently, this subjectivation of perception culminates in the impression that even the existence of objects depends on the perceiver, as it were a pathological form of Berkeley's esse est percipi, to be is to perceived. For example, patient describes, whenever I took my eyes off the hospital guards, they disappeared. In fact, everything at which I didn't direct my entire attention seemed not to exist. At a party, everything seemed to originate from him or depend on him. If I perceive a door and then look away, then it's almost as if the door ceases to exist. And the last patient had the impression that she was the only person who really exists and that she was responsible for the whole world to move on. So a kind of solipsistic self-centrality. The explanation, I think, is obvious. If perception has lost its objectivity, that means also its open intersubjectivity, its sharedness, so to speak, then the objects seem to exist and to move only for me, or even by my grace, because I am here. And then the object permanence acquired in early childhood is lost again. Objects seem to disappear if I don't look at them. With growing subjectivation, the act of perceiving itself may come to awareness, and then the patients are like the spectators of their own process, of their own perceptions. I saw everything like a film camera, and for me it was as if my eyes were cameras and my brain would still be in my body, but somehow as if my head were enormous, the size of a universe, and I was in the far back and the cameras were at the very front. So I was extremely far away from the cameras. So here the subject gets into a position even kind of outside the world. He literally becomes homunculus in the head, like shown here, with looking at his own perceptions like at projected images. So in all these cases, we see that perception does no longer transcend itself and reach the objects as such. Its objectivity, its implicit intersubjectivity is lost, and the patients are kind of enclosed in a solipsistic inner world. Now, as a typical example of how this condition may transition into delusions, we can take the following case. Patient describes, it seemed ever more unreal to me, like a foreign country. And then it occurred to me that this was no longer my familiar environment. It might not no longer be our house. Someone might set this up for me as a scenery, or maybe it could be transmitted to me as a television play. And then I touched the walls in order to check whether this was really a surface. So again, the patient's perception is obviously subjectified, but in this case, the inversion of the perceptual field already creates the impression that an external power is somehow responsible for it. And getting more and more terrified, the patient was finally struck by the evidence that a foreign secret service abused her for experimental purposes and projected fake images into her brain. Now, as we can see, the subjectivation of perception already prefigures the loss of intersubjectivity, prefigures, and that we find in full-blown delusion, because it fundamentally shakes the basic trust in the shared, reliable world. And on this background of an intolerable ontological uncertainty, the relieving effect of the delusion that now arises results from converting the disturbance of perception into something that seems to occur in the world, namely an assumed persecution by mundane enemies or powers. In other words, the disturbance of perception is converted into a reframing of the perceived. And sense-making is thus re-established, as the German term Wahnsinn, or deluded sense, already indicates. But this re-established sense-making or re-established reality is, of course, fundamentally decoupled from the shared world of the others. The transition into the full-blown delusional conviction, the final loss of open or shared intersubjectivity, is marked by a typical change of attitude and language, namely a loss of the as-if. That means at first the patients still maintain a kind of critical distance to their experiences, and which is usually expressed in as-if clauses. So it is only as it seems as if something extraordinary is going on. And these clauses imply the preserved capacity to shift one's perspective and to take still an external point of view from which what seems to be the case cannot actually be true. And this is still the eccentric position, as Plessner has called it. I quote another case vignette here. I could no longer think the way I wanted to. It was as if one could no longer think oneself, as if one were hindered from thinking. I had the impression that all what I think were no longer my own ideas at all, as if I wouldn't be the one who's thinking. And I began to wonder whether I'm still myself or an exchanged person. Now, again, the patient finally dropped this reservation of the as-if and came to be convinced that a criminal organization had implanted a chip in her brain to control her thoughts. So the onset of delusion is usually marked by a breakdown of the as-if. And this implies not only a change in the degree of certainty, but also the definitive loss of open intersubjectivity. The as-if is the last connection to the shared world. However, the ambiguity that is inherent in the "it seems as if" is at the same time too disturbing and even tantalizing for the patient to be maintained for a longer time. Finally, it is dropped, and the loss of the as-if is then tantamount, means a breakdown of the perspectival flexibility, which would still enable the patient to take a general point of view and to gain a distance from the situation. It means a loss of the eccentric position. We now finally turn to the specific interaction with the deluded patient. We find a peculiar structure of non-understanding, which is ultimately based not on a disagreement about particular facts, but it is based on a disagreement about the fundamental assumptions on which the conversation is based. In normal verbal interactions, mutual understanding is achieved through reciprocal utterances, taking each other's perspectives, clarifying mutual meanings, etc. And in the process, we continuously shift between the ego and the allocentric perspective. However, in the conversation with the deluded patient, all these processes remain strangely futile. When confronted with doubts or objections, the patient doesn't adequately respond. On the contrary, he will either assume a consensual understanding of the situation, even this is not at all the case from our side, or he will justify his claims in a way that is not in the least sufficient for the interlocutor. So you might ask, but how do you know they implanted a chip in your brain? And the patient might say, well, I just can feel it. And if we then ask ourselves how it is possible that someone maintains a belief as unusual as that, so having a chip implanted in his brain or having his biological sex changed overnight, then the question, or our question, already shows that we have lost the common ground with the patient. This shared background of certainties is based on a bedrock of certainties, as Wittgenstein had called it, a background of assumptions that we rely upon without explicit awareness. And it is based on a certain amount of accumulated experience, which has sedimented into our implicit knowledge and expectations, and results, for example, in an everyday physics, which tells us that humans just cannot fly out of windows into the air, or in an everyday biology, which simply excludes that people's sex could change overnight. We live and we act on the background of these certainties, not because we have ever concluded or made sure that they are true. They are just self-evident for us. However, for the deluded patient, this background has fundamentally changed. With the radical subjectivation of his perception, the basic trust in the shared world has been shattered and common sense has lost its validity. The emergence of delusion turns precisely the radical subjectivation of experience into a new objectivity for the patient. That means into a new self-evidence, which the patient can no longer doubt. The new certainties are outside of any possibility of doubt or justification, no different from the certainties that we rely upon in our world. This means that the communication with the deluded patient has lost the background of implicit intersubjectivity and common sense, on which mutual understanding is ultimately based. This would seem to imply that delusions are indeed incomprehensible, as Karl Jaspers argued. However, I think this claim may be too strong. It would be overstated to say that the loss of shared meaning implies absolute incomprehensibility. After all, it is still possible to translate the patient's utterances into our own language, provided that we take the transformation of the patient's world into account, as I've tried to describe, at least to a certain amount. In order to understand the patient's delusional world, we have to temporarily suspend those certainties that constitute the bedrock of our reason itself. To conclude, I've shown in my first part that the constitution of reality is based on two levels of constitution. First, the level of sensory-motor interaction of organism and environment, or we can also say it is based on embodiment. And second, on the level of social interaction or intersubjectivity, which also may be called participatory sense-making, shared sense-making. In human perception, both levels are inseparably linked, and through a twofold decentering, they together constitute the objectivity of perception. We live in a world of objects which are not only there for us, because we enact it through our sensory-motor engagement, and we live in a shared objective reality because we continuously enact it through our joint engagements and through our participatory sense-making. This co-constitution implies that human perception is embedded in an implicit or open intersubjectivity. I've analyzed, so even in the absence of others, my perception implies their possible presence, which that is what is meant by open intersubjectivity. I have analyzed how in beginning psychosis, this decentering structure of perception breaks down, leading to a subjectivation of the perceptual field, to an inversion of intentionality, and thus to a fundamental derealization that is the condition for delusion formation in the further course. In delusion, the intersubjective co-constitution of meaning is finally sacrificed in favor of a new coherence of the perceptual field. The loss of the as if, as I finally pointed out, signifies the crucial step of a decoupling of subjectivity from open intersubjectivity, and it manifests itself in a loss of the eccentric position or the capacity of perspective taking, at least in as much as the domain of delusion and the content of delusion is concerned. This would be the structure of perception and sense-making and communication that is peculiar for schizophrenic delusion. And finally, maybe a short outlook. The fundamental alteration of experience at the roots of schizophrenic delusions resembles, interestingly, in many respects, the state of dreaming, because here too the shared world is replaced by a private world of figments and imaginations. The subject becomes the center of the world. All situations show a kind of self-referential significance. That is what we typically experience in delusion. And the shared world is replaced by figments and imaginations that are not recognized as such and lack the reservation of an as if. We have no critical distance to what we experience in delusion, in dreaming. And so we arrive at a interesting parallel or analogy to the state of dreaming, which reminds of a famous sentence of the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, who spoke of the idios cosmos, of the own world of the dreamer, in contrast to the koinos cosmos, the common world which we share at daytime. And his famous quote runs as follows: "The waking have one common world, but the sleeping turn aside, each into a world of his own." Fortunately enough, our patients are able to awake from this dreaming state in the course of our treatment. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Thomas. We will have time for discussions after the second talk, yeah. I think two take-home messages. I mean, psychosis is a dream-like state, an interesting concept. But I think, putting that aside, I think what's fascinating is to see what happens if we don't just use a mental state examination to declaratively say, that's a delusion, that's a perceptual aberration, that's a voice-hearing sensation. But the subjectivity of experience brings actually these elements into play with each other. They are connected from delusional mood to a full-blown delusional state. There's something happening which is described in the German word Wahnarbeit. I don't know if this is actually translatable. Anyway, we will go. Professor Ryan McKay. Ryan is Professor of Psychology, Department of Psychology at the Royal Holloway University of London. He's the head of the Morality and Beliefs Laboratory. His research explores themes of belief and identity, and Ryan is interested in how we make sense of ourselves and our place in the world. His work encompasses clinical delusions, political belief formation, religion, and morality. And I found this very interesting statement on his website, quote, "I also dabble in some other topics. For instance, I have some recent projects on swearing, both in the sense of profanity and in the sense of solemn vows." Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Frank. There's no microphone. Can everyone hear me? I guess online as well. Just check that I can change the slides here. Yes, thanks very much. It's really real pleasure to be part of this symposium, and I very much appreciate the invitation. I'm going to start out my talk today by juxtaposing two interesting beliefs. The first one is my husband has been replaced by an imposter. And secondly, I was saved by God to make America great again. Now, there's reason to doubt the truth of each of these beliefs. Following Thomas's fascinating talk, I don't want to outright claim that they're false, but I think it's fair to say that neither of them is grounded in intersubjectively verifiable reality. So how can we explain beliefs like this? Well, I think it can be instructive in answering this question to step back and consider what the function of belief formation might be. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through two contrasting functions of belief formation. And we'll consider each of our opening examples through the lenses of these. Okay. First of all, we have the epistemic conception of belief formation. Now, on the epistemic conception, our beliefs are like models of the world, maps by which we steer, in the words of Frank Ramsey. So we live in an uncertain world, and we want our beliefs, we want the function of belief formation to be to reduce or to resolve this uncertainty. So today I believe that the symposium would begin at 2 p.m, and I arranged my travel plans accordingly. If I'd received some evidence contradicting that belief, I would have updated my belief accordingly and changed my plans. So that's the epistemic conception. Now let's revisit each of our opening examples through the lens of this conception. First, we'll start with the example of miraculous divine intervention. Okay, so in a recent interesting paper, Francesco Rigoli and Jack Lennon argued that religious beliefs, including the belief in divine supernatural intervention, arise out of statistical inference in human brains. More specifically, they argued that religious ideas function to explain residuals or prediction errors, gaps between predicted outcomes and observed outcomes. So let's consider our opening example here. Now, a bullet loosed on a trajectory towards President Trump points to a very grim outcome for President Trump, at least. And of course, this is what transpired in a field in Pennsylvania last July while President Trump was on the campaign trail. But against all odds, President Trump moved his head at the last moment, and the outcome that obtained was very different. So there's a discrepancy between the outcome we might have predicted here and the outcome that was observed. And given that discrepancy, President Trump and his supporters assign, if you like, a very high posterior probability to the hypothesis that God had intervened to save him. And indeed, in terms of explanatory power, this miracle hypothesis is actually quite strong. So the likelihood of Mr. Trump surviving if God had intervened trumps, if you like, the likelihood of him surviving in the absence of a miracle. Now, I just want to unpack this a little bit so it's very clear what I mean by this. So we've got two conditional probabilities here. First of all, the probability that Mr. Trump survives if God intervenes. And I think it's fair to set this at or near 1. If an all-powerful supernatural agent intervenes on your behalf, I think survival is pretty much guaranteed. But what about our other conditional probability, the probability that Mr. Trump will survive in the absence of a miracle? Well, this is going to be much lower. Mr. Trump himself described the shooter's task on that day, the would-be assassin's task, as akin to sinking a 1-foot putt. Now, I'm not myself a golfer, but in the extensive research that I undertook in preparing for this talk today, I learned that any putt within 2 feet is a guaranteed mate for any golfer. And Mr. Trump is apparently a highly skilled amateur golfer, so we can assume that it would be very unlikely that you would miss a putt and, by extension, a shot like this. So maybe that would only happen 1 in 1,000. So by these numbers, the explanatory power of the miracle hypothesis outstrips the other hypothesis by a factor of 1,000. And Mr. Trump and his supporters duly claim that he had been saved by God. All right, what about our other opening example? So as many of you will know in this room, the belief that a loved one's been replaced by a physically identical imposter is a bizarre delusional belief known as Capgras delusion, named for Joseph Capgras, the French psychiatrist who published the classic cases. Now, in a prominent neurocognitive account of this delusion, the delusion stems from damage to neural pathways that underpin the emotional component of face recognition. And the idea is that this damage generates an anomalous experience of face perception, an experience that can be characterized as a discordance between the way a familiar person looks and the way that they feel. Now, interestingly, there have been a few attempts over the years to put this hypothesis or this idea to empirical test. I'll just tell you very briefly about one of these cases. So this is a study led by Hayden Ellis back in the late 90s. And their paradigm involved presenting participants with a series of faces, familiar faces intermixed with unfamiliar faces. They hooked their participants up to a skin conductance machine, which was meant to gauge their autonomic or kind of emotional reactivity to the stimuli. Now, unfortunately, my slide has slightly stolen my thunder here. That grey bar is supposed to be covering the Capgras patients. But anyway, you can see the pattern here. For the two patterns of control participants, the familiar faces, represented by the red bars, have elicit a higher degree of skin conductance response. But for the Capgras patients, there's no pattern of autonomic discrimination between the familiar and the unfamiliar faces. So results like this, which this has been replicated in a number of different studies, have been taken as support for the idea that Capgras delusion involves some kind of disruption to the emotional component of face recognition, yielding an anomalous experience of faces. So to make this a little bit more vivid, imagine this woman here wakes up one morning. Unbeknownst to her, she's had a stroke in the middle of the night that has disrupted her emotional component of her face recognition. She comes down to the breakfast table, for instance, and encounters her husband. And she might think, well, that looks like my husband, but something feels a bit off. He feels like a stranger. So in that context, she may conclude that he's been replaced by an imposter. The imposter idea may have a certain intuitive appeal, given that discordant experience of how her husband looks and how he feels. Now, just as with the miracle hypothesis that we've already discussed, in terms of explanatory power, the imposter hypothesis might be quite strong. So the likelihood of this man before her who looks like her husband feeling a bit off if he'd been replaced by an imposter might be quite high, and may exceed the likelihood of him feeling a bit strange if he hadn't been replaced by an imposter. What about other delusions? Let's consider a few cases here through this lens. We'll start with a classic case from the literature. So in October 1879, a young woman was admitted to the state lunatic asylum in Danvers, Massachusetts in the US, with the belief that she had a hive of bees buzzing around inside her skull. She complained of a noise in her head, and according to Brendan Mayer, who's a Harvard psychologist who wrote a lot about delusions, she suffered from tinnitus. So for Mayer, she had an anomalous kind of auditory buzzing experience, and that anomalous experience was what furnished the content of her delusion of having bees in her head. Another example, mirrored self-misidentification. So some patients believe that the person they see when they look in the mirror is not them, but a stranger, someone perhaps living in their home or who may be following them around. So this is known as the mirror sign or mirror delusion or mirror self-misidentification. Back in the early 2000s, Nora Breen, who is a colleague of mine in Australia, she's a neuropsychologist, she published some interesting cases of this and interesting analyses. I'm just going to show you a brief video snippet of one of her cases.
Who is that?
So this is where we don't actually have audio here, I don't think. There is audio with this, but anyway, you can read the subtitles hopefully here. But
who is that?
That's not me.
Who is
See,
it?
it hits me straight away. I mean, I thought, first of all, I didn't like his face at all. But I've got used to his face, and I have a smile every now we go to the bathroom for wash or whatever. But it's not me.
It's not you.
No.
So this is the person that you see in your house?
Yes.
Okay, and it's not you?
No.
Okay. What does that person look like?
Well, he looks like me.
He does look like you?
Yes, I see that.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yes. He's not a bad-looking fella.
So he's quite a character, this gentleman. I do have another video that is going to require audio, so I'm not sure if that's going to be possible. It's not a big deal. We can just skip it if need be. Okay. All right. So in Nora Breen's paper, this patient was referred to as TH. Now, when they subjected TH to a range of different tests, it turned out that his face perception was intact. So he wasn't prosopagnotic. The problem was that he couldn't recognize his own face in the mirror. But further testing revealed that he suffered from what's known as mirror agnosia. So basically, he had an impaired appreciation of mirrored spatial relationships and was unable to interact appropriately with mirrors. So just to give you an example of the kind of test that they did, they would sit him in front of a mirror. Imagine there's a mirror here, place an object on his shoulder and ask him to reach for the object, whereas you or I would use the mirror to navigate back and take the object. TH would kind of smack his hands into the mirror or try and reach around behind it. So it seemed that TH had an anomalous experience of reflected space. He had this impaired appreciation of mirrored spatial relationships. And it seemed that for him, looking through a mirror was akin to looking through a window. And when you see somebody as if through a window, that person's inhabiting a different region of space from you and so cannot actually be you. So they surmised that this anomalous experience is what furnished the content of his delusion. Final example, Martha Turner and colleagues published an interesting paper a few years back about a patient with delusional déjà vu, otherwise known as déjà vécu. Now, this patient had sustained a severe head injury, and following that, he would claim when watching certain televised events, sporting events and major news events and whatnot, he would claim that he had experienced these events before, he's seen this before, even though the events were actually live events. So he kind of rationalised this as saying that the events must be being screened as a kind of delayed telecast. So they investigated this patient and concluded that he had suffered a disruption to recognition systems located in the temporal lobe, and this disruption had generated false feelings of familiarity, or an anomalous experience of familiarity, and that's what was the source of his delusions, that he had lived through these events which were in fact current and contemporaneous. Okay, so we've reviewed a few different cases of delusion here. In each of the cases, the delusional hypothesis that is adopted can be thought of as an explanation of an anomalous experience. And in each case, the explanatory power of each of the hypotheses is quite strong. So as I already reviewed with the first example, the likelihood that your husband might feel a bit off if he's actually been replaced by an imposter outstrips the likelihood of him feeling off if he hasn't been so replaced. The likelihood that you'd experience a buzzing sound in your head would be quite high if you actually had a swarm of live bees in your head, and that would be greater than the likelihood of a buzzing experience with no bees in your head, and so on. So at the bottom, for instance, the likelihood of a news report feeling familiar to you, if you had in fact experienced it before, outstrips the likelihood of it feeling familiar to you if it's the first time you've experienced it. So all of these delusional hypotheses have this in common. They have quite high explanatory power. And they share that in common with the Trump bullet case, which we reviewed. So in each of these cases, the beliefs that are adopted have high explanatory power. And we can think of each of these beliefs as an attempt to accommodate an unusual, anomalous experience, either through epistemic frameworks that are culturally sanctioned, as in the religion kind of miracle case, or through epistemic frameworks that are individual and personal and idiosyncratic, as in the delusions cases. But explanatory power, of course, is not the only consideration that should guide belief formation. If you're a rational individual, you should also take into account the prior probability of a hypothesis when forming beliefs. Now, centuries ago, the philosopher David Hume put forward an argument against miracles, and he effectively argued that the probability of a miracle is so low that no evidence could ever be sufficient to justify believing in a miracle. So yeah, he thought that the prior probability of a miracle is vanishingly low, vastly lower than the prior probability of no miracle. So is it irrational to believe in miracles? Hume thought so. I'm not so sure. In a religious country like the United States, the cultural prior, if you like, for a miracle may be quite high. So you might be inhabiting an environment, a kind of environmental backdrop where that idea is sort of in the water, if you like. There's cultural support or cultural scaffolding for that idea, which might raise the prior. And in that context, if you observe or even learn about evidence consistent with a miracle having occurred, you may rationally adopt the belief that a miracle has occurred. Ironically, David Hume's argument may be more effective in undermining a rational basis for delusions than in undermining a rational basis for miracles. And this is because the prevailing psychiatric conception of delusions is that they're personal and idiosyncratic and not widely shared. So there's no cultural scaffolding for these beliefs. So as an example, the idea that your loved one can be replaced by an imposter is there's no cultural framework for that occurring in our society, in our culture. So anyone should assign a very low prior probability to that belief. So while Melania might think, well, that looks like my husband, but something doesn't feel right, feels like a stranger, she should reflect on the vanishingly small probability of an imposter having replaced her husband, and she should retain the belief that he is in fact her husband, however unpalatable that may be. So I think that to explain delusions, we need to invoke a kind of dysfunctional departure from the axioms of rational belief revision. My own preferred approach or preferred explanation is that delusions involve a bias toward over-accommodating anomalous perceptual experiences. And it's a bias toward favouring hypotheses which have strong power to explain anomalous experiences, irrespective of the prior probability of those hypotheses. Now, of course, all of us, to some extent, tend to favour the evidence of our own perceptions over the evidence of what other people tell us. This makes, so this is on the left here, this makes good evolutionary sense because there's ordinarily no good evolutionary reason to scrutinise the deliverances of our perceptual systems, but we should be wary and vigilant of ostensive information, which is information communicated by others, because other people may stand to gain from deceiving us. So this asymmetry that you see here may be kind of generally adaptive. Generally, we're biased towards trusting the evidence of our senses over testimony of others. But in the case of delusions, the scales may tip too far in the direction of prioritising perceptual experiences, in particular anomalous perceptual experiences. And this may create an apparently kind of paradoxical combination of credulity with respect to the deliverances of our perceptual systems and scepticism with respect to the testimony of others. Now, this tendency may be underpinned by prediction error dysfunction, perhaps by a dysfunctional surge of prediction error signalling, which renders the anomalous experience particularly striking and all-encompassing. So while Melania ordinarily should disregard the delusional hypothesis, in the context where she's experiencing this kind of prediction error dysfunction, that hypothesis may be so striking and anomalous that it really overwhelms her kind of critical faculties, if you like, and sidelines or overwhelms considerations of prior probability. In that case, she may adopt the belief that her husband has been replaced by an imposter. Now, this overweighting experience idea ties in quite nicely with a classic finding from the experimental literature on delusions. Now, many of you may be familiar with this classic study, but I'll just briefly recap it in case you're not. It was led by Philippa Garrity and colleagues. So the first author here is Huck. So Huck and colleagues in 1988 drew beads from one of 2 hidden jars. Now, each of the jars contained coloured beads in complementary ratios. There were 85 red beads on the left and 15 yellow beads. In the jar on the right, 85 yellow beads and 15 red beads. Now, the 2 jars are hidden from view, and the experimenter selects one of the jars, ostensibly at random, and draws a sequence of beads out of the jar one at a time. And the task of the participant is simply to stop the experimenter when they're ready to decide which of the 2 jars they think that the beads are coming from, the mostly yellow jar or the mostly red jar. And what they found is that relative to control participants, patients with delusions required fewer draws before reaching this decision, and indeed nearly half of them decided on the basis of just a single bead draw. Now, that's the draws to decision variant of this paradigm. There's also an alternate version of the procedure called the graded estimates variant, in which participants are shown a fixed sequence of beads, and after each of the beads, they have to rate the probability that the beads are coming from each jar. So the first bead out of the jar might be a yellow bead, and you might think, okay, maybe it's a 70% chance now that the beads are coming from the mostly yellow jar. You see another yellow bead, you might go up to 90% or so, maybe 95%, 99% or so, and then you see a red bead. Now, the red bead kind of is disconfirming evidence as far as the mostly yellow jar hypothesis goes, so you should revise your belief to some extent. Now, there's some evidence that patients with delusions are more likely to over-adjust their ratings when faced with this potentially disconfirmatory evidence. So we can think of this in terms of the scheme I outlined earlier. Given that the yellow beads at this point are pointing towards a particular hypothesis, the beads are coming from the mostly yellow jar, in that context, the red bead is sort of a prediction error. It violates the prediction that you've got up until that point. So you might think, well, red bead, perhaps it's the mostly red jar after all, but you should reflect on the fact that most of the beads so far have been yellow. And of course, even from the mostly yellow jar, there are some red beads in there. So you should expect some red beads to come out. And you keep in mind that it's still probably the yellow jar. But in the context of this kind of prediction error dysfunction, perhaps this anomalous prediction error evidence that you have is much more salient and overwhelming, and you disregard these considerations of prior probability and conclude instead that it's probably the red jar, so you over-adjust your ratings. Okay, so that concludes the kind of whistle-stop tour of the epistemic conception of belief formation. Now I want to shift and tell you about the social conception. This part is not going to be quite as long as the first part, but I want to consider each of our beliefs from a different conception of belief formation. Now, this moves, I think, to some extent, I'm not a psychiatrist, but out of the realms of psychiatry into a different type of conception. But I think it's quite interesting and important. So, as we've started out with, the world is an uncertain place. But to cope with this uncertainty, we need more than accurate models of the world. We also need to cultivate social alliances. And through the beliefs that we form and express, we can help to form and preserve these valuable alliances. Indeed, we may be motivated to form and express beliefs that signal whose side we're on. So the graph on the left here shows a decade of kind of political divides over climate change in the United States. And the psychologist Dan Kahan has explained this kind of polarization in terms of the social function of belief formation. So he said, if you take an ordinary member of the public, their carbon footprint is too small to make an effect on climate change. If they make a mistake on the science in that part of their life, nothing bad happens to them, but they can be adversely affected if they're holding a deviant view on an identity-defining issue inside their social group. So if you're a steel worker in the Rust Belt, for instance, you may have very little to gain by conforming your beliefs to the scientific consensus on climate change, but you may have quite a lot to lose socially if you go around trumpeting that consensus. So there may be important social signalling motives from holding or expressing certain kinds of beliefs. Now, sometimes in order to reap the benefits of this social signalling function of beliefs, you might need to express beliefs that flagrantly contradict the available evidence. So here's an example. So this was a study run a few years ago by the political scientists Brian Schaffner and Samantha Lux. They simply presented their participants with 2 photographs, photograph on the left, A, and on the right, B. And they asked their participants a very simple question: which photo has more people? Why not make it interactive? If you can help me out here. So show of hands, who thinks photo A has more people? Who thinks photo B has more people? Okay, all right, so that very strongly replicates what they found. Most people in their study thought photo B had more people. However, 15% of Trump voters answered that photo A had more people. Now, just in case you're unfamiliar with the kind of political context here, they each, of course, show photos of presidential inaugurations. On the left, we have President Trump's first inauguration in 2017, and on the right, we have Barack Obama's first inauguration in January 2009. And you may recall that there was a bit of a hullabaloo after President Trump's inauguration concerning who had the bigger inauguration crowd. And his communications director at the time, memorably insisted that President Trump had the largest inauguration crowd of all time, period. And yeah, anyway, that was an interesting moment. So it may be, the point here is that our beliefs may be like kind of tattoos or uniforms. They can mark us out as members of social groups. So through the beliefs that we form, we can express our commitment and solidarity with these groups. And it may be that holding steadfast to a belief that flagrantly contradicts the evidence is an especially kind of costly signal of commitment to a group. And if we take that idea to its logical conclusion, then the more outlandish and absurd the belief is, the stronger a signal of commitment it will send. So here's a fairly outlandish belief. In November 2021, hundreds of people gathered near Dealey Plaza in Dallas. This was the site of JFK's assassination in 1963. The crowd met there to welcome the return of JFK's son, John F. Kennedy Jr., who had in fact died in a plane crash in 1999. And they believed that once Donald Trump was reinstated as president, he would step aside so that Kennedy Jr. could become president. So this is pretty out there, even by the standards of kind of QAnon and whatnot. And it raises a psychological puzzle. How can people believe such things? So people like Dan Williams, who's a philosopher at the University of Sussex, has argued that the apparent absurdity of this kind of belief is actually the point. It's strategic. So the idea is that the more absurd the belief is that you signal, the in-group belief, the more credible a device it is to signal your commitment. It's akin to kind of having an insignia of your group tattooed on your face because it burns your bridges with other possible groups you might want to join. So if you're a member of the in-group and you see this guy with his tattoos on his face or espousing fairly radical in-group beliefs, you might think that's a stand-up character because they're not going to be welcomed into any other group. So it's a really strong signal of commitment to the in-group. And this shows the kind of vast kind of disjunct between the epistemic conception of beliefs and the social conception of beliefs. Because on the epistemic conception, we want our beliefs to be as accurate as possible, right? But on the social conception, truth can actually be irrelevant. And in the worst case, the function of espousing a belief might mean that you end up with the most absurd beliefs possible, beliefs that actually flagrantly contradict the available evidence in order to send this stronger signal. So whatever the epistemic merits of belief that Mr. Trump was saved by God to make America again, expressing this belief might garner you some social rewards depending on the social and political circles that you move in. Now, I was going to show you a video there, but I'll skip over that. So just to conclude, what about delusions? What about the belief that a loved one's been replaced by an imposter, or the belief that the person in the mirror is a stranger? So personally, my view is that delusions like this, what makes them delusions is not just their falsity or not just their unresponsiveness to evidence and not just the harm that they cause, but it's the fact that they are kind of out of touch with the kind of social milieu. And in particular, deluded individuals can't effectively marshal their beliefs to negotiate social situations. So in this sense, patients with delusions are suffering from two kind of failures to conform to the function of belief formation. Their beliefs are, if you like, epistemically deficient in terms of unresponsiveness to evidence, but they're also failing to fulfill this social function of beliefs, this social signaling function. That's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. I mean, judging by the fun that some of your slides created, we are politically united. So, questions for both Thomas and would you mind to come back and?
Oh, sorry.
Because we have about 5 minutes, I suppose, before we go into the break. Comments? Yes.
Can I put an alternative particularly about technology and alternative view from research, and that it's, I mean, I love to talk, but there is another way of looking at the creation of delusion, a program. Jim Van Ops talks about, but there's a new hypothesis about 7 or 8 years ago, the notion of affective change and an affect in the program. So just to give a plug to my research, which was a few years back, patients with delusion tend to do things. I'm a forensic psychiatrist and very violent. So a publication I had back in about 2013 showed that anger, the affect of anger, was the key issue that drove the patient to violence. So many of the delusions were quite common, persecutory delusions, most of the patients had. This is from the first episode of Psychosis Channel from this catchment area in East London. But the key thing was the link between the delusion and the violent behaviour was mediated by angry affect. And so what I didn't see in the explanation, much of which I really enjoyed, I'm fascinated by, was the possibility that affect could actually be affecting. There's something in your talk about the interruption of emotional circuits. I was thinking in Capgras syndrome, but so I was thinking about the disruption of emotion. So affect. What do you think about that?
Well, thank you. Well, there was at least one mentioning of affect in my talk, which was not related to anger. That's true, but to anxiety and uncanniness, so perplexity, and these are crucial affective states that kind of let the as if tip over, so to speak. I talked about the as if, which would mean a state of still holding tight to the usual commonsensical or social beliefs. That would be a kind of a sign of still clinging to the shared beliefs. So it seems as if the other, my husband was replaced by an imposter. So if the as if is maintained, then there's still a connection to the shared belief of others, to shared beliefs. But the affects of anxiety and increasing perplexity and uncanniness let the patient kind of shift to the and drop the as if. So it's definitely the case that my husband has been replaced by an imposter. Now the affect of anger, I think, is important for understanding additional consequences of delusional beliefs, namely, for example, defending oneself actively and even fighting the other. So that is dependent on the reaction towards the perceived persecution. The persecution can increase anxiety, but it can also elicit anger or all kinds of aggressive feelings, and then they let the patient take action, so to speak. But it's not the affect of anger that leads to the delusion itself. That's at least my opinion.
Jeremy, very briefly, yeah, because I have a few others. Mark, please.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me as very common to so many delusions, especially with a paranoid persecutory element, the grandiose element, is that what would you rather be? A crack addict with no hope from the cancer state, or Archangel Gabriel? I know which one I'd go for if I absolutely believe that, and I'm prepared to discount the terrible consequences of it. But it seems to me that it's shoring up a fragile sense of threat and sense of self. And never mind it's crazy. Why not getting into life? But why not when the alternative is to remain in the ghastly life of comfort?
Well, I mean, I certainly agree. I think a lot of delusions can be seen through that lens, especially delusions, I guess, that Louise, I think, was going to talk, like grandiose delusions, for example. You could certainly see how certain grandiose delusions might give someone a sense of meaning and purpose, and you're especially, that boosts self-esteem and whatnot. other delusions are a bit harder to kind of see through that lens. I mean, yeah, so there's a sort of obviously a fairly long tradition of kind of Freudian style theorizing about some delusions. So like Capgras delusion, for instance. In fact, in Capgras's very first paper on Capgras delusion, they had a kind of thoroughgoing kind of Freudism. They suggested that this young woman's delusions about her father being replaced by an imposter were a sort of defensive cover for the fact that she had latent sexual feelings towards him. So they had this kind of whole motivational, kind of emotional sort of psychogenesis built into it. But that seems wrong in those cases. But I think sometimes I think that there's a lot of truth in what you've said. But sometimes for some of these delusions, because of the kind of outlandish emotional formulation of some of them, they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater to some extent. But absolutely, so you might think, well, the paranoid case, how could that be explained in emotional terms? Because this person's inhabiting a frightening, anxiety-inducing world. But yeah, if the alternative is far less dramatic, there might be some benefits that you're getting from that belief system.
Thanks. Yes, please, up there.
Oh, thanks. Management and you spoke about how social interactions are important to the formation of a sense of reality and how that helps to form some unquestioned certainties of the way that things happen, which, as Brian talked under, are actually not so unquestioned. But what I was wondering was, is social interaction and that form of engagement with the world and other people protective against certain entities of mind, or is it kind of an unrelated phenomena? I think there's a lot of low patients with schizophrenia who admittedly seem so alone, both in the way that they are orientated to the external world and also the absolute values.
In absolute terms, sorry?
They're alone because of the organization of their mind in relation to phenomena, and the way you said, they're all crucially alone.
Yeah.
So basically in line, my question is, does social interaction protect against delusion?
Yeah, I got this question. Yeah, thank you. What we at least know for sure is that social interaction can lead to or can facilitate the emergence of delusion in certain cases, namely when the interaction is characterized by distrustful relationships, relationships with a group that is somehow hostile towards the patient or the becoming patient, so to speak, or when there is interaction between a subgroup of people, such as a migrant group, in an environment where they don't feel well received, or where they feel a hostile environment. This is a kind of interaction that is certainly detrimental for patients with a given vulnerability for schizophrenia. If the interaction can be protective, on the other hand, that is not very well established, because certainly an environment that is more friendly and more receptive, positively receiving the patient, the potential patient, can mitigate or alleviate this vulnerability. But I'm not sure if there's any research on kind of proactive or preventive social interaction leading or preventing delusion. At least so far, I wouldn't know about research in this direction. Do you, maybe?
Sorry, research on whether social
interaction can be preventive, can be kind of lead to prevent delusion formation.
I think it's almost certainly the case.
Yeah, but there is research on this.
I think there is research on this. It's not in the literature that I know very well, but I think Richard Bentl's done some research along these lines. Yeah, definitely a kind of protective factor, social relationships. So yeah, the social aspect can be kind of symptom and cause.
Yeah. Okay, if that's the
Okay,
case,
now
then
we'll take
the
one
better.
more question. Deborah, please.
Your model do make a lot of intuitive sense and have lots of base identity. I'm just wondering about whether you have any results from research or ideas about how we clinically can apply these to help the way we talk to our patients about their delusions and or treat them.
Yeah, well, I think it is important to use these concepts of shared reality constitution to at least remain aware that there's an impediment to shared reality constitution in patients, and that it doesn't make sense to use the discussion about the facts and about the interpretation of facts to gain common ground, because this common sense towards the shared reality related to shared reality is somehow lost for the patient. So it is all the more important to acknowledge this and to try to establish another kind of relationship on other areas and in other domains, so to speak, and acknowledge that there is no mutual understanding at the moment with regard to the real content of delusion. But all the more it is important to establish a shared reality in other parts of the everyday life. And there are many ways to establish and to agree on shared reality in everyday life, in the course of the clinical encounter and in the course of clinical processes, and to establish and to confirm and maintain all these occasions for being in agreement is all the more important for the patient in order to feel part of the community again. And then he can gradually alleviate his kind of control over the delusional contents.
Right, thank you very much. I hope that Louise will also help us to unpick that question a bit, and it clearly points towards the fact that our systems are not really conducive really to those kind of processes. It's a time consuming process, and that's not really the zeitgeist, unfortunately, of our psychiatric care arrangements. So we have a short break. Please be back at 15:02 for the second half. Thank you. To Dr. Louise Isham, and you can see that she's going to talk to us about the aspect of treatment. And I'm really glad that we didn't lose you, Louise, and over to you before you get any kind of technical problems again. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you ever so much for inviting me to speak today, and also for accommodating. I was due to be there in person, but my father is unwell, so I'm unable to travel over there today. So yeah, thank you ever so much, and sorry that it's caused so much difficulty with the tech, but hopefully it will work now. I did have a couple of videos. They are subtitles. What I'll do is I'll just play one and you can read the subtitles, but I won't play the other probably. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about the Feeling Safe program, which is a theory-driven psychological therapy that's the most effective psychological therapy that we have for persecutory delusions specifically. Any of you that are involved in research will know this very well. Research is a team sport. It's definitely not something that you do in isolation. And actually the research that I'm presenting has really been led by Professor Daniel Freeman, not myself. He is the head of the research group that I work in, the Oxford Cognitive Approaches to Psychosis Research Group. So he's a clinical psychologist and NIHR senior investigator. And he's really spent the last 20 plus years of his career focused on getting a really sort of nuanced understanding and developing a treatment for persecutory delusions specifically. And it's his work that's led to the treatment results that I'm going to present today. So all credit to him, and also some of these slides, a lot of the slides are his as well. So I can't really take a lot of the credit for this. Just a couple of other acknowledgements as well. Felicity Waite, who is the deputy of our research team and has also contributed an awful lot to the research I'm presenting. We do everything together with our lived experience advisory panel. So the Feeling Safe LEAP is made up of people who have lived experience of persecutory delusions, who have informed the research at every step of the development, both the kind of theoretical understanding and the treatment develop as well. So we couldn't have done the research without that team. And then also just to acknowledge our wider research team, our other collaborators, and of course all the participants in the research study. So I'm just going to go on. I'm going to play this video. I'm afraid the sound's not going to play, but you will get a flavour of what the person is saying. And just to clarify, this is the audio is of somebody who, a real patient who took part in Feeling Safe and the research trial that I'm going to present. And they're talking about their experiences of persecutory delusions and also of the therapy.
I was scared of mostly everything. Going outside, opening the front door, it's everything. People were going to hurt me. I wouldn't go out on my own. I wouldn't do anything. I used to feel like everyone was watching me, everyone was looking at me, everyone was judging me all the time. I have trouble with voices in my head, which are very unkind. They say quite nasty things. They put me down a lot, and it makes you feel low. It makes you feel unhappy. They're bullies, basically. I think things I missed out on because of being scared of everything was I missed out on a lot of my kids growing up, basically. Doing the Feeling Safe programme was the best thing I've ever done, because what I learned and what I can do now is amazing. And being more aware that people aren't going to hurt me anymore. You know, you have the odd day where you think, oh, but they're just little blips, basically. The things I can do now after doing the Feeling Safe is I can go and take my dogs for a walk on my own. I can go into a shop on my own. I can cycle to my mum's on my own. And over time, I've learned that these voices, yes, they are bullies, but nothing has happened to me. I go out, I haven't been stabbed, nothing's happened to the kids. And over time, I've learned that, yes, although they are bullies, I'm not going to listen to them like I used to. It feels magic being able to do these things that I couldn't do before, basically. And to realise that people aren't all bad. The world is a good place. You've got to get out there and enjoy it.
So why did we develop the Feeling Safe programme? Well, the upshot is that treatments need to be vastly improved. 2/3 of patients with psychosis don't see even a halving of their psychiatric symptoms with medication. Of those that are medication resistant, 90% don't see a halving of those symptoms with standard cognitive therapy. As a psychologist, I'm particularly interested in the psychological therapy. And we know that when added to standard care, cognitive therapy for psychosis does have a positive effect on delusions, but it's of a small size. So Cohen's effect size of about 0.3. And so to just give you a sort of contrast for those of you that aren't familiar with that, you know, if we look at something like cognitive therapy for social anxiety disorder, which is very effective, the kind of size of effect that we get there is in the region of 1.6. That's a very large effect size. And furthermore, the treatment effect comparisons for CBT psychosis, it's typically been against patients who don't receive a control therapy. So most CBT for psychosis trials have patients getting the therapy plus treatment as usual versus treatment as usual. And that means that we don't understand what it is about the psychological therapy that might be helping. Is it just having somebody that's coming along who's kind and nice and talks once a week, or is it something about the particular targeted focus? Furthermore, patients with persecutory delusions typically have extremely poor psychological well-being. So almost half of patients with persecutory delusions are in the bottom 2.5% of the general population for psychological well-being. And of course, we know that lots of these patients are in severe psychological distress. So there's a risk of suicide with very high levels of suicide ideation. So the take-home point, what this boils down to, is that treatments and psychological treatments for delusions need substantial improvement. So that brings us to our target. And what we wanted to do with the Feeling Safe programme was to develop a treatment that has large effect size reduction for persistent persecutory delusions that's in the scale that's more similar to what we get with anxiety disorders. To put that another way, what we wanted to do, the aim, was to develop a treatment, psychological therapy, that has a 50% recovery rate for persistent persecutory delusions, so that the person no longer holds the belief with more certainty than not at the end of treatment. We view persecutory delusions as threat beliefs, unfounded threat beliefs, which leave the person feeling profoundly unsafe, cause huge psychological distress, and prevent them from doing the things that they want to do. So our target for therapy from a patient perspective is to help somebody feel safer, feel happier, and be more able to do the things that they want to do. So how do you go about developing a treatment that's going to do all of that? Well, thankfully, there is an effective process, and that's summarised in this paper by Daniel. If anybody's interested, it's in the British Journal of Psychiatry and published last year. And I can send links around if people are interested. But I'm going to run through the 10 key principles because it outlines the approach that we've taken to this research. So the first step is respect for patients. Respect in the treatment delivery should be obvious to patients. They should feel respected, and that is so often the opposite of what our patients experience. But it's not just respect in the case of the treatment delivery, it's got to be built into the treatment development itself as well. So when we're developing the intervention, we're thinking about building into that approach flexibility to accommodate inevitable differences. So in terms of, for example, patients' readiness to do certain types of work, their different preferences for learning styles, patient choice about what they would like to work on and what they don't want to work on. And we want to make sure that that information is always presented in a thoughtful and transparent way. The second is about precision. So the diagnosis of psychosis, as all of you will know, encompasses a huge variety of distinct symptoms. So from grandiosity, paranoia, hallucinations, cognitive disorganization, anhedonia, and so on. Plus, on top of that, you have people presenting with multiple comorbid difficulties as well. So anxiety, depression, and so on. So we need to be really clear in our when we're developing a treatment. What are we targeting? What's the treatment outcome that we want? What mechanisms are we targeting? Like, what is the driver of that problem that we're trying to target with our treatment? And how are we going to do that? What are our therapeutic techniques? So we want that level of precision. And that links to this third point about mechanisms. So we want to be really specific about the mechanisms that we think drives the problem, in this case, persecutory delusions, because those are the things that we need to target in order for the treatment to have the chance to be successful. The fourth principle is about framing positive counterweights. And again, we've just got a recent paper that's come out, I think, in the last month or so in Psychological Medicine, for anyone that's interested, but about the way you frame, I guess, an alternative belief or the counterweight. Essentially, the idea here is that, and sort of as was alluded to in the previous talk, directly challenging a delusion or, in fact, any strongly held belief rarely works to make the belief go away, and often can actually make the belief be held more strongly. So if you think about political views and going up and just telling a Trump supporter that you maybe think that they are wrong is unlikely to get the result of them suddenly giving up their beliefs and thinking a different way. So instead, what we want to do is develop an alternative belief that can coexist with the threat belief, the persecutory belief, and build up new evidence for this alternative belief until, as you kind of see in the image, you want the scale to tip. that the evidence for the new belief becomes outweighs and becomes dominant. So, for example, a persecutory belief might be MI5 are leading a conspiracy to mentally and physically harm me. And perhaps the alternative belief that I want to start with is maybe I'm safer than I thought. Maybe I'm safe enough on this occasion to go out of the house and buy something from the shops. And you build from there. Maybe I'm safe enough on another occasion. Maybe I'm safe enough to go further afield until you get to the point of maybe I'm safe enough to do the things I want to do. So you're trying to build up an alternative belief rather than tear down the threat belief. The fifth principle is about allowing for complexity. So we certainly want to target causal mechanisms that drive the problem. So in this case, persecutory delusions. But the reality is that causation is likely to be complex and multifactorial. So there's very unlikely to be one causal mechanism. It'd be nice if it was this simple, but one causal mechanism that we can target, and then that's it, and that's going to treat persecutory delusions for everybody. And in fact, we would consider the causal mechanisms involved in paranoia and persecutory beliefs as what they call INUS conditions, which I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's enough to make my head spin. It stands for insufficient but non-redundant part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. What that's saying is that each factor on its own, each maintenance mechanism is unlikely to on its own cause an outcome, persecutory delusion in this case, but it's a necessary component of a larger set of circumstances that does produce the outcome. But that's not the only way that the outcome can be produced. So really what this boils down to is that there are many different factors that are likely to cause, be working together to cause persecutory delusions and maintain them. And that will differ for different people. So there needs to be different routes to target this in terms of treatment. So essentially, treatments are more likely to be able to address that kind of clinical need if we're able to personalise and if that's included in the design of the intervention. The sixth principle is about building in measurement. How do we know that something's working if we don't measure it? And how do we know how it's working if we're not measuring those mechanisms that we're trying to target? So this is critical. And clinically, we would also use measurement not just at kind of regular intervals, as part of a research assessment, but also to inform the clinical practice. So every session, I will do some brief sessional measures to get a sense of how is the person doing with their persecutory belief, their safety belief, the extent to which they're able to do the things they want to do, their distress, and then also brief measures of whichever mechanism I'm targeting, so that the patient and I can look at that together and see, where are we at? Have things changed since last week? If not, why not? Let's look at it that way. So measurement's really important. It's critical in this kind of work to do consultation with people with lived experience. It has to be an integral part of the treatment design. Otherwise, how on earth are we going to develop a therapy that actually meets those needs and is both accessible and acceptable to the client group? It's also true that patients often find it helpful to hear the stories of others who've undergone similar experiences. So we want to try and develop those, collect those accounts from very early on in the design process and embed them in the intervention. So the animation that I showed you earlier, unfortunately, you couldn't hear the patient's voice, but that's somebody's own account of their experience of feeling safe, which we've now built into the next iteration of Feeling Safe, which is a therapy called Feeling Safer. Interesting, patients' perception of treatment credibility is associated with better outcomes. So the therapy development, both the theory underpinning it and the clinical testing needs to be rigorous so that it's credible, and that needs to be communicated clearly and simply to patients. So that's an important part of how we introduce the therapy when we're first kind of speaking to a patient. We tell them a little bit about the evidence. And similarly, it's possible for patients to have optimism if a treatment has been shown to work well, and that optimism is again associated with better outcomes. So we need to be able to clearly explain to patients how likely this therapy is to help, how often it helps people, what the likely outcomes are. And that can really help counter that disillusionment and those feelings of hopelessness that patients can sometimes have who've been in services for many years. And then the final principle is about planning for implementation. It's no use us developing a treatment that works really, really well for 1% of people with persecutory delusions but doesn't work for the other 99%, or that's really brilliant but so expensive to implement or too difficult to train therapists to deliver. We need to be thinking about implementation in the wider NHS from the very beginning. So that's the principles that have underpinned the kind of design and the work we've done to develop Feeling Safe. And there was a sort of sequence of events that happened really over the last 15 years or so. So firstly, there was a lot of research looking at understanding the causes, the psychological causal mechanisms of persecutory delusions, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. Then there was work done to develop a treatment for each causal mechanism. So one mechanism, one driver is worry, the process of worry. And so there was a research study which was developed to specifically see whether a treatment designed to target worry, it was a very brief intervention, 6 sessions, but does a treatment that targets worry in people with persecutory delusions, does it lead to a reduction of worry? And secondly, does that then have a knock-on effect to reduce the persecutory delusion? And actually that it did. That was in a randomized control trial, just testing that small part of the intervention. So we had to kind of develop the treatment for each causal mechanism, develop a better therapeutic style that would lend itself to this client group, testing out each element individually, as I've just said, so with the trials targeting a particular mechanism. Importantly, showing that the factors, these mechanisms are present in large numbers of patients and that patients actually want them treated, they want help with them because, again, the therapy has to be something that's attractive, that patients want to engage with. We then needed to work out how to combine each element effectively, test the full treatment, the whole lot in a case series, and then a randomized control trial. And all of that was done throughout with people with lived experience. So it's that RCT that I'm going to present the results of in a minute. But there was a lot of work behind this, all led by Daniel. So this is just a snapshot, but if you're interested in the papers, just let me know and I can send someone. So in a moment, I'm going to tell you about the results, but first I just want to outline the kind of our theoretical understanding that underpins this. So essentially, we view persecutory delusions as unfounded threat beliefs, although it should be said that very frequently our patients have had and do live in environments where there is ongoing real threat too. And so often people have both. They will have a real threat in their environment, difficult circumstances, but or past history of trauma, but also they have this threat belief that has become overgeneralized and excessive. And what we want to do is develop this alternative competing belief that the person is safe enough now. So that's what we're aiming for. But the person is going to have many experiences where they formed associations between certain stimuli, like going into a crowded space, going out into the local shops, into a coffee shop, busy streets, and that has been associated with threat. And so what we need to do is we want to be getting people out back into those environments, but to instead have an experience where they discover that they're safe enough. So we want to form these other associations, these competing associations with a sense of safety. I've mentioned this already. Just to explain what these mechanisms are, there are 5 key mechanisms that we targeted in the Feeling Safe study. So the first was worry. So worry brings persecutory ideation to mind, elaborates the details and increases conviction. Negative self-beliefs, feeling that one is inferior, not as good as others, directly fuels a sense of vulnerability to harm from other people. Voices and other anomalous experiences. This was came into both of the previous talks, which I found fascinating. You know, people trust their senses, and so if you hear a voice telling you that somebody's trying to kill you, it's hard not to believe that. So the voices are directly fueling, or other anomalous experiences, directly fueling the paranoia as well. Sleep dysfunction, we know that this both has a direct impact on paranoia, but it also acts via some of the other mechanisms that can increase hallucinatory experiences, for example. And then the last mechanism we call defense behaviors. For those of you familiar with cognitive therapy, this is also sometimes called safety-seeking behaviors. And this is where people act in a way that they believe provides a defense against harm. So they build up their defenses, like building up a big castle wall and hiding behind it. So that might be things like avoiding going out or only going out with other people. But that prevents access to that evidence to support the alternative belief that actually maybe now you're safe enough. Maybe things have changed. Maybe actually now you are safe enough to go out into the world and do these things. So those are the mechanisms. And what we know, there was a survey that Dan did in just under 1,000 patients with severe paranoia. And he found that all of these 5 mechanisms were very, very commonly present in this patient group. So almost 80% of people with severe paranoia had levels of worry that would meet criteria for a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. So that level of worry. 2/3 had diagnosable clinical insomnia. Again, just under 80% had avoidance of a level of agoraphobic avoidance. Over half had extremely low self-esteem, very low negative self-beliefs, and about 2/3 again were hearing distressing voices. So these mechanisms are very common in patients, And luckily for us, they're also things that patients want help with. So actually, if you go between these two slides, you see that the numbers that want help with worry, this is the numbers that have sort of GAD level worry. The numbers that actually want help with worry are slightly higher than the ones that have sort of diagnosable GAD. And that's because, of course, these things are on a continuum. And so even where the worry hasn't quite got to the point of being diagnosable as generalized anxiety disorder levels, people still say, yeah, this is a problem and I want help with it. So overall, we have, 98% of people have at least one of these factors present. 96% want help with at least one of those things. So that's encouraging because it suggests to us that if we offer this therapy, it might be something that people want and will engage with. The way the therapy looks, it's hard in a short amount of time to do it justice. I'm happy to stay for questions and answer those at the end if there are more questions on this, or if I have to go, I've put my email address at the beginning, so please email me. But essentially what we do, it's a manualized and modular intervention. So the way that works, we target one mechanism at a time. So we do a brief assessment, usually a session, and then we get straight into the patient will pick which relevant mechanism they want to work on first. And then we have a series of booklets for that mechanism. So we have a series of 6 booklets called Winning Against Worry, which are all about helping somebody reduce worry. And then we might move on to the next one. So we have booklets for each mechanism. The therapy in the trial was delivered over 20 sessions over 6 months. Interestingly, we'd have regular reviews. So I was one of the trial therapists on this study. So I would see the patient very often, but every sort of 6 sessions or so, when we finished a module, finished targeting a particular mechanism, Dan might come and join, and we'd go out, the 3 of us together. He would have usually done the assessment with the patient together with me at the beginning, and the 3 of us would sit and review. A little bit like, I don't know, it's a little bit like having a PDR or something. We'd look and see, well, how's that gone? What do you make of it? What do you want to do next? What's the next place? So we liken it, it's on the next slide. It's a little bit like interval training, high intensity interval training. We do some quite intensive therapy, then a pause for reflection, and then another bout of quite intensive therapy. We do outcome measurements throughout every session. Weekly clinical supervision was absolutely critical. The way, as a trainer, so I train clinicians and therapists how to do therapy. I think this is really imperative. It makes sure that as a therapist, you stay on track. You don't deviate too much or get distracted or wing sessions, which is very easy to do in very busy clinical services, but it keeps you focused. And typically patients had 3 or 4 of the modules, so very few people would have had all 5. And of course, I said before about comorbidity, there were sometimes it was necessary to build in other aspects of treatment. So for example, there were people who presented with PTSD alongside their psychosis, and sometimes we would need to treat the PTSD within those 20 sessions as well. So where necessary, we drew on other models. As I said, the therapy was quite intensive. So typically we'd meet somebody once a week, but it could be twice a week. And we would certainly aim to have contact with people between sessions. So phone calls, text messages, email, whatever worked for the person themselves. And that was really about helping the person put things into practice and problem solving quickly if there was a difficulty, and really kind of supporting that person to try and make sort of behavioural changes as well. You can see there the most common module that pretty much everybody had was the one about going out into the world and dropping defences. We were targeting defence behaviours. And then you can see somewhere between 30 to 50% of people got the other modules. Our model of working is this. It's all about activity. We do very little sitting in a room talking. We do a lot of going out with people, trying things out. So to give you an example, well, obviously, if we're going out and trying to drop these defense behaviors, so if a person's been avoiding a particular area, I had somebody I worked with in Feeling Safe who for 20 years hadn't gone to a local town. It's somewhere that they'd previously worked, and she believed that there were people there, previous employers, that were trying to sort of part of a mafia that were going to kill her. And so after some other work we did first, we then did some really targeted work where we were going out and about, planning on going on a bus, getting on a bus through that town, then planning getting off the bus, then walking around the town, then me sitting in a coffee shop and her walking on her own. So really getting active to go out and just rediscover safety, to discover that she could be in that environment and be safe enough. But even when we're working on other things like worry, for example, we will be really active with somebody. So Any of you that are familiar with cognitive therapy for GAD or worry will know that one of the key techniques is about trying to reduce the total amount of time somebody spends worrying. So we will introduce a technique called worry periods, where somebody has a set time each day or a couple of times each day where the worries are present and they engage with them. But the rest of the time, we help people learn to postpone worry. And actually, some of the best activities for postponing worry are being active, doing things. So we would be out practicing this with other people. And actually, though, there was a question earlier about social isolation, and I don't think there's research, I could be wrong, that you'd need an enormous study to show that social contact could prevent transition to psychosis, but there certainly is research that shows that social interaction can reduce paranoia in the moment. And I think one of the things that we found when we do the worry work is that, if you call somebody, if you have a conversation, it gets in the way of that worry process going round and round and round, taking you to worse and worse catastrophic outcomes. So we'll be active in whichever module that we're targeting. It's definitely an out and about therapy, a doing therapy rather than just a talking therapy. Okay, so I'm mindful of time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I just want to very briefly share the results with you. And again, I was going to play a video which summarizes them, so I'm hoping that will, I think it's translated, but I've got subtitles, but you won't be able to hear the sound. Anyway, the results were published in 21 in Lancet Psychiatry. We wanted to know if feeling safe could have large effect size post-treatment reductions in persistent persecutory delusions, in contrast to befriending. So we had an active control. Both groups got treatment as usual, but the control group also got befriending with the same therapists. So there was a matched control. And then this I can send you a link to if anybody wants to watch the recording, but I think we do have subtitles, so hopefully you will be able to see the results here.
Many people given a diagnosis of psychosis experience persecutory delusions. They feel very unsafe. These fears can make them withdraw from ordinary life. We want people to get back to the things they like doing. So we've developed the Feeling Safe program, the culmination of 15 years of research and clinical practice, and developed in conjunction with people with lived experience of the problem. Feeling Safe translates the best psychological science into a groundbreaking cognitive treatment for persecutory delusions. Over 20 sessions, the program helps people develop new memories of safety and address the factors that often maintain persecutory thoughts. For example, worry, poor sleep, or low self-confidence. This cognitive treatment is manualized and modular. Patients choose what they work on. It's an active therapy, based on the belief that people make gains by trying things out in everyday life. The Feeling Safe trial, published in the Lancet Psychiatry, shows that the program is the most effective psychological treatment for persecutory delusions. 50% of people experience large benefits from feeling safe, with a further quarter making moderate gains. Conventional CBT for psychosis has a small benefit in reducing delusions, an effect size of 0.3 compared to treatment as usual. When we did the tougher test of comparing feeling safe to befriending therapy delivered by the same therapists, Feeling Safe produced a large benefit in reducing delusions, a remarkable effect size of 1.2.
My life is so incredibly different now. I'm in control of my life now, not my voices, not my paranoia, and not my worry, but me.
So, there we go. Just to kind of underline those results again, we found that at 6 months at the end of treatment, the effect size on persecutory delusion severity was 1.2. So, and that's over and above befriending, which also we know has within subjects significant effect. So that was really brilliant. We were delighted with that, and suggests to us that there is something about this kind of specific targeted mechanistic approach that gives you more than just over and above the kind of just going and talking. I have to say befriending was also great, and I really enjoyed befriending as a therapist. So, you know, that's definitely something that we should be doing more of as well, I think. But this did have quite a significantly, both statistically and clinically significantly large impact over and above befriending. And we did get the recovery rate we were aiming for. So half of people no longer had the persecutory delusion at the 6-month end of treatment. A further 25% didn't get that as well as that. We didn't get the recovery, but they made moderate benefit. But there were still a quarter that didn't benefit. And that's really important because we clearly still have work to be doing to try and understand what it is about some of these patients that means that they didn't benefit. This is quite complicated. I'm not going to try and go through it all now, and I'm not sure I fully have digested it yet. But one of my colleagues, Lucy Jenner, has done some really clever research looking at trajectories of recovery and found that there are sort of 4 patterns of patients in the Feeling Safe study. So you had patients who had very high conviction. Obviously, everybody coming into the trial had high or very high conviction because they had to in order to be defined as a persecutory delusion. But there were people that had very high conviction who didn't benefit. There were people who had very high conviction that did extremely well. There were people that had moderate conviction, high conviction and moderate improvement. And there were those with high conviction and large improvement. And she's been looking at what factors predict the difference really and who might do well with each. One of the things that I think it does look like, which is really interesting, is that those that had the high conviction and little improvement, actually it looks like that group perhaps does better in befriending, which is exciting in itself because that means that there may be another option for us to explore. But we need a lot more research to understand this. I was going to play you a video just hearing from one of the participants, but it won't work so well without the audio. So I'm going to leave it there and hopefully take some questions if there's time. But yeah, thank you ever so much. It's been great to talk to you about this, and I hope it's been interesting for you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Okay, I know that you are also pushed for time. I know that Graham will have to leave at spot on 5 because of the family commitment. So let's allow for 2-3 questions before we go on to the last speaker, please. Who would like to? Can I actually start? I was surprised about the 20-session dose that so that doesn't sound to be much to me. So it's quite surprising that 20 sessions make such a profound difference. And related to that, I mean, you call it cognitive therapy, but it sounds really you stress the fact that activity is the main component. Maybe
Yes.
It's the behavioral aspect, the exposure therapy that really works here.
Yes, I think, I shortened CBT to cognitive therapy rather lazily, but you're absolutely right. And we do think the behavioral part is absolutely critical. And I suppose one of the things that's interesting, and actually I might be able to just very quickly share a slide, which is a real slide from a therapy session. So I'm just going to share this very quickly if I can. This is the trajectory of recovery in terms of the threat belief that we saw with one of the people I worked with. And essentially the out and about part, this was somebody that was quite hard to get out and about. And you can see what happened to the threat belief when we started going out and actually testing it out and discovering safety. But the thing that sort of blocked being able to do that beforehand were the things like worry. So that kind of really pervasive worry meant that they became so convinced that something terrible was going to happen that they wouldn't leave the house in the first place. So you target some of these other things like the worry and the sleep that are the blockers to learning safety. But absolutely, I think the out and about bit, you can see what happens here is it just had a massive impact when we were able to start going out and finding that safety evidence. So yeah, very behavioural.
Thank you very much. Jeremy?
Very impressive results. But what percentage were not on medication?
Sorry, I couldn't catch that. Could you repeat the question?
The question was, what percentage of patients was not on antipsychotic medication?
Oh, almost all were. Yeah, they almost all were. Yeah, I think in fact they all were at the beginning. It's whether people came off them at various points, but yeah, absolutely. So these were mostly recruited from CMHT, and they were people with persistent persecutory delusions. So they were in the mental health system and under CMHT, some hospital as well.
So is this a primary treatment or is this a form of rehabilitation?
Question is primary treatment versus rehabilitation. How would you qualify what you're doing?
Well, I mean, we don't know. There's been one trial by Tony Morrison, which is very interesting, very promising, which actually does directly compare cognitive therapy to medication in an EIP sample. That was a very hard study to get ethical approval or funding for, but the implication is that both are, in that initial study that needs more replication, but both there's equivalent. You get benefit from each. You get the best result if you combine medication and psychology. I guess kind of what we want is there to be a point where there's patient choice and where they can have the best of both worlds.
Right. I think we've got to make a move on here from you, Louise. I'm very grateful that we managed to hold on to you. So you instilled hope really into the discussion that there is treatment available and that it makes a real difference to patients. Thank you very much again, Louise.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
So last but not least, I'm going to introduce our last speaker. Professor Graham Murray is Professor of Psychiatry and Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. He's also a consultant psychiatrist in early intervention services. I think it's actually worth mentioning that he studied physics and philosophy in Oxford. So we have this multitude of perspectives, even in one person. His research focuses on the causes, mechanisms, and treatment of mental illness, mainly psychosis and depression, and uses a variety of research methods, including epidemiology, neuroscience, computational psychiatry, genomics, electronic health records, and clinical trials. He leads the early psychosis workstream at the NIH Translational Research Collaboration, and I think he's very well equipped to give us the talk on the predictive coding theory of psychosis and neuroscience perspective. Thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much for the invitation and for everybody for coming to listen. So, how do I advance with the clicker? What do I need to do? Just click this one. Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about predictive coding. I'm going to talk about perception. I'll talk a little bit about perception and hallucinations as well, and then I'll come on to delusions. I think one of the nice things about the predictive coding theory of psychosis is it at least purports to give an explanation for both hallucinations and delusions, which is, of course, what we see in schizophrenia most of the time, although not all the time. I'll talk about predictive coding perception, health, psychosis, and then talk about belief formation and in psychosis towards the end. Okay, so perception as inference. So we've heard a lot today about how prior expectations and beliefs influence your belief updating, and we'll come on to that. But they also determine our perceptions as well, don't we? So here, if we look at the screen, most people think that you can see two triangles on the screen, one white triangle with black outlines pointing upwards, and overlaid on that an upside down white triangle with white outline pointing downwards. But if you look closely, there's actually no triangles. And this is the Kanitsa, famous Kanitsa illusion. Okay, so because we know what triangles, we've learned about triangles, we expect to see triangles in the world, and we see triangles even when they are not there. We see illusory contours. I'll just give you a moment to read those sentences. Most people read the first one as Jack and Jill went up the hill, and the second one as the last event was cancelled. But if you look at the exact shapes on the screen in went and event, they are identical. So when we know the meaning of a sentence, it changes our perception of letters, shapes, and words. So meaning, beliefs change our perceptions. And our expectations are always shaping our experience as our interactions with the world affect our beliefs, our perceptions. They in turn shape our expectations and so forth recursively. Okay, we know that hallucinations are common in certain situations. They're not only the preserve of schizophrenia. Many of us will hear our voice being called when we're in the shopping center. Many of us think our mobile phone is buzzing in our pocket when it's not. Many of us who've been on call have hallucinated our bleep or our pager. And this is adaptive, isn't it? When we're expecting something, our brain is primed to detect it, and it can be useful, but of course it can also be extremely maladaptive, or mildly maladaptive, I should say, in health, and very maladaptive in illness. Okay, so the predictive coding framework, rather analogous, I think, to what we've heard today, but just seen through a different lens, a framework in which the mind constantly updates its model of sensory input, or the brain, if you prefer, how prior beliefs shape sensory data, and they're updated through prediction errors, which we heard about from Ryan, surprise signals that help us update, and perception. You could consider that as an interplay between the prior expectations and the sensory input, rather, as he was telling us about in terms of belief formation, perception, the same thing. And we could have a little schematic of the brain where there are higher level areas of the brain, like the frontal cortex, that encode our perceptual belief, or encode our conceptual beliefs, and then lower level perceptual beliefs and sensory input. And it's the interplay between these things that help to determine our perceptions and beliefs. And we can also look further at a more microscopic layer of anatomy. So I'm going to take you back to neuroanatomy and to remind you that our cortex is laminar in structure. I forgot about this for many, many years and practiced quite happily. And of course, you can practice quite happily. But I just completely forgot that the cortex has a laminar structure after learning it originally. But it's interesting in relation to predictive coding, because predictive information flows through the brain in a laminar structure. So we might look at the visual cortex, and we might say, take the most basic area of the visual cortex, V1, and we say, how do these expectations from other parts of the brain, more complex, higher order parts of the brain, influence our perceptions in V1? And so it seems that the predictive information coming along these descending pathways comes from the lower layers of the higher cortical area, and project in a laminar structure both to the lower layers of the lower order area and to the so the layer 1, 1 and 2, and layer 5 and 6 receive the expectation information, and the sensory information is being transmitted along the middle layers. So this has been, of course, you can study this in rodents and animal studies, and you can make perturbations and so forth. And so I started to get interested, of course, in this again, when you see what a beautiful mechanism it is for enabling the predictive information to then travel in a particular anatomical way and then be united with the sensory information. So the predictive information is somehow, as yet not completely understood, interacts with the sensory information, and then a signal is passed up, a prediction error signal is passed up to the next area, and so on and so forth, where's this further interaction. This is happening hundreds or thousands of times across different regions of our brain to generate our cognition. That's the framework. Okay, so can we look at this in humans? We can look at this in humans. We can't look at the neural firing directly, but we can look in functional brain imaging, and you can do a functional brain imaging study of illusory contours. So you can lie in the magnet, if you have a very strong magnet, a 7 Tesla magnet or above. Standard hospital 1.5 Tesla, standard research 3 Tesla. You need a very strong magnet to be able to get a very close-up picture of the different layers of the brain, and you can't even get all 6 layers, but you can get sort of superficial, middle, and deep if the subject stays very still and doesn't move their head. Okay, so on the first one, we can see, because of the way these Pac-Men are organized, you see the illusory contour here. So there's an illusory contour inside. The subject can't see this yellow circle, but this is where we're going to analyze the data, at this illusory contour here. But if you organize the Pac-Man in a different shape, there's no illusory contour. So we just contrast the brain activation at this point between the two conditions, and we look in the deep, the middle, and the superficial layers. And what we're expecting from this schematic is we'd expect the superficial layers to show a difference and the deep layers to show a difference, but the middle layer, there should be no difference because there's nothing on the screen there. And the researchers, Peter Koch, who's now at UCL, showed that you could at least detect the difference in the deep cortical layers. Didn't find this one that was expected in the superficial, but at least it partially confirmed what was based on the animal studies, what you'd be expecting to see in humans. So this was in healthy humans. Okay, so I'm just going to give you another paradigm where our past experience shapes our perception. Does anybody know? Don't say what it is, but can anybody see what is on the screen here, or do you just think it looks like just a mess? Okay. If I show you this now, and now I show you this again, and it's amazing, isn't it? In this one, you just are exposed to the picture for just a couple of seconds, and then you can see it. So you very quickly learn what to expect to see, and once you expect to see it, then you can see it. So I'll give you another example. And then again. Okay, so you can take this to the lab, and we can look in patients. So some of my colleagues in Cambridge looked in our clinical service and took an experiment where patients, not with frank psychosis, but with the so-called at-risk mental state, help-seeking patients with attenuated psychotic symptoms, and showed them these moony, black and white, so-called moony images, or ambiguous or black and white unclear images, and asked to detect a target and which ones had a target or not, an image inside. And then you show the clue, and then you show the answer again. But they're all mixed up. You don't show the clue and the answer and retest immediately afterwards. So you see a range of them to make it difficult. And what they showed actually, and you can look to the degree to which people improve after they get the manipulation of the prior information. And the interesting thing here was that the patients actually were more influenced by the prior information once it was delivered than the control. So they seem to be sensitive to this manipulation. And another way of studying it was done by Phil Corlett and Al Powers and Chris Mathis, who Powers and Corlett were at Yale. And they did an experiment a few years ago where they conditioned people to expect to hear a tone in the scanner. So they flashed a flashing checkerboard at you while you're lying in the scanner. And every time you see the flashing checkerboard, you get a tone. You hear a tone, which sometimes was loud and sometimes was quiet. But every time you see the checkerboard, you hear the tone. And after a while, of course, then you can you emit the tone certain times or make it quiet. But if you've done it enough, every time that you show the flashing checkerboard, people sometimes think that they've heard the tone, just like you sometimes think your phone's gone off in your pocket. And they had a group of people who had hallucinations. Some were patients, some were healthy people with hallucinations, and they had some controls. And they found that the people who had hallucinations were much more likely to say, yes, a tone is there, when there was no tone there at all. And that was the case for both the patients who had hallucinations and actually the healthy hallucinations. Okay, because they're in the brain scanner, they can look, and of course, no surprise, when you hear a noise, your auditory cortex is activated. But then what they did was they looked at this brain region and they said, what happens when there's no tone, but people think there's a tone? And this is what they plotted here. So you take the brain activity when people say there's a tone, even though there isn't any, and the brain activity here in the auditory cortex is positive, despite the fact that there's no sort of bottom-up signal coming to engender activity. It's all to do with your expectations. We don't know if it's causal, though. Of course, with brain imaging, you're just observing a correlation. So you don't know, is it the brain activity that causes the perception, or is it your perception that causes the brain activity? But it's an interesting result. Okay, and then they went on to do some fancy computational modeling. And their fancy computational modeling, Mathis is the modeler, suggested that the prior beliefs were given more weight. So the training, which engendered the prior beliefs, were given more weight than sensory data in the people that heard voices. And so they could provide some mathematical evidence to suggest that that was the explanation. Okay, so, but I have to tell you that this study was only in about 15 and 20 patients, and the study that we did in Cambridge was, again, similar, just something like 20 patients. And there've been a whole slew of studies, all in about 20 patients. So with Chantal Miller, my PhD student, we thought we would meta-analyze this data. And also some of the studies are conflicting. Some show opposite results to some of the others. So Chantal looked at all of the studies in that had this kind of manipulation to see how much patients do change their perceptual judgment on the basis of manipulations of prior expectations. And when she looked through all of these studies, she found about 30 that were okay to be 34 studies that could be included in the meta-analysis, a total of over 1,000 patients and over 1,000 controls. Okay, and what did she find? So this is just patients versus controls, and we can see the forest plot here, and we can see it's completely, some of the studies are showing that the patients have weaker priors, some of the studies are showing the patients have greater priors, some of the studies are showing no effect. When you pool it all, you find nothing. Okay, now, of course, some of these patients had positive symptoms, some had negative symptoms, some had no symptoms, some are ill, some are in recovery, etc. So we wanted to look to see what about if you meta-analyze the relationship to hallucinations in the top corner here and relationship to delusions here. And unfortunately, not every study reported this. So we're now down to much smaller sample size. It looks like there might be something there with hallucinations, but it's not significant. So that's negative for now. And then for delusions, there was, there's really no relationship at all. Okay, so, but I have to say there are many different tasks here. And the other thing that Chantal did is she did a study in healthy people where she got about 50 healthy people to come into the lab, and she did about 10 different predictive processing tasks on them, and then she correlated them all with each other. Because what most of us psychiatric researchers do is we do one cognitive task, and then we like to generalize to the entire psychological domain of all walks of mental life from the single 15-minute test that we do in the lab, and I've done that, and so have other people. But what Chantal showed was they don't all correlate. So if you do the one with the checkerboard and expecting hallucinations, it doesn't correlate with how you do on the one with the moony images and so forth. So I think part of the trouble is we've got too low sample sizes, and also we're probably conflating different kinds of studies together and also different kinds of patients together. Okay, so what can we do to get better data? So I'm going to give a plug for a study I'm doing at the moment. It's funded by the government, the Mental Health Mission, and which is a large infrastructure project. And I'm leading the psychosis work. And we're doing an exemplar study as part of this, which is a very simple cohort study. There are more than 10,000 people with instant psychosis in England every year. We're trying to get a couple of thousand, which is difficult, but it shouldn't be impossible, to take part in a very simple study where they give a blood test, they answer some questionnaires on a phone or on the internet. They give permission, if they're happy, to be recontacted, to be invited into trials or further observational studies, because we want to do trials. We need more trials, don't we? And we get permission to take information from the electronic health records. So we don't do 8 hours of interviewing, which even though we'd like to, we instead do a very brief interview, and then we try to take the information from the health record. So we'd love to get every trust in the country involved, and we'd love your trust to be involved if you would be happy to do so. And we hope there will be lots of trials coming through in the future. And then if you're part of this, that will help the patients could be recontacted. Trials. So if you want to take part, you can scan the QR code and you can put your name on our mailing list, and then you get information about studies And you also get, there's a grand round that we do every 3 months. I'm going to ask Louise and Dan Freeman to come and talk to us in our grand round one time. We do a case presentation and some science. So you can email us, you can scan the QR code, you can get in touch with me. We'd love to get you involved. And as I say, yeah, we hope there will be we're in discussions with the Wellcome Trust about a very big trial, which will be a MAMS trial, which is if you know the recovery trial in COVID, you test several agents at the same time. You have 5 different interventions which are randomized to 1/5 versus or placebo, and you need thousands of patients to make these MAMS trials work. And we're in discussions with the Wellcome Trust about hopefully getting that going in the UK. So we'd love to get you involved in that. Okay, so I'm going to skip on a bit for the sake of time. Yeah, and I'm going to do a last few minutes on some further neuroscience. Okay. How do we update our model of the world? We update our model of the world through experience. Surprise, prediction error is very important for learning. Modern theories of associative learning center on prediction error, the mismatch between expectation and outcome. If you know The Simpsons, you'll know the episode where Homer invents the everything's okay alarm. It goes off every 3 seconds to tell you that everything is okay. Is it a good idea? It's not a good idea. What you want is an alarm that tells you when things are not as expected. And that is thankfully what our brains have with prediction error. And you can mathematically formulate prediction error with a very simple little equation, which can explain the behavior of rats whilst they're doing conditioning studies, humans while we're learning causal associations. It very nicely describes the behavior of dopamine neurons when you're doing recordings of dopamine neurons whilst monkeys are learning about whether a sound gives them a little bit of apple juice reward. And the dopamine neurons are the neurons par excellence that report a prediction error signal, although they're not the only ones. And it explains the behavior of the brain MRI signal whilst humans are learning about rewards and associations. And we showed years ago that the brain prediction error signal is abnormal in first episode psychosis, in the midbrain and in the cortex, and we replicated again in the ventral midbrain and the substantia nigra, where the origin of the dopamine neurons are that, yeah, the brain signal for prediction error is abnormal in psychosis. So we've seen that now. What about uncertainty in the environment? What about precision and uncertainty? We should take this into account, shouldn't we? We should take uncertainty into account when we're learning and updating beliefs. And the predictive coding theory suggests that we should update our beliefs not just by prediction errors, but by prediction errors scaled by a metric of uncertainty, which you could call precision. Mathematically, it's the inverse variance. And could failing to adapt learning to uncertainty contribute to psychotic symptom pathogenesis? So we want to do a test where we can look at brain prediction error signals, but at different kinds of precision. So here's the game that we get you to play. You have to guess what the answer is, and you might say, I think it's 23. This is how much you might win in a raffle. And actually, it actually is going to be 44. So you say, I think it was 23. The computer tells you it was 44. On a random number of the trials, random one of the trial, you win the actual amount, but you can see the exact prediction error there. You can calculate it mathematically. It's 21. Okay. We also give people a cue where we tell them how much variance, how variable the environment is. Tell them it's going to be very variable or it's not going to be very variable. And the cue tells you how variable it's going to be. And then we can see how much variability modulates the prediction error. And what we can see in healthy people under placebo, well, first of all, you can see the brain prediction error. In this task, the prediction error is mainly a cortical signal in the superior frontal cortex and the cingulate. And in some healthy volunteers under placebo, when the environment is precise and there's not much variance, you get a nice strong prediction error signal, but it's attenuated, modulated by precision. So we have a precision weighted prediction error signal in the superior frontal cortex under placebo. If we give dopaminergic drugs, we can modulate that prediction error signal. Antipsychotics are not good for the prediction error signal of healthy people. They impair the prediction error signal of healthy people. Okay. What about in psychosis? So we do a study in about 25 patients with psychosis and 25 at-risk mental state. We can look at learning. Over time, patients do learn in the orange, but they learn slower than controls, and they learn, if you do some mathematical modeling, in a more basic way, whereas controls take precision weighting and they take uncertainty into account, and they're flexible in their learning. They learn a lot at the beginning, and then they ignore what could be irrelevant feedback. And they precision weight their learning, but the patients don't so much. And we've seen in several studies now that the brain prediction error signal is there. It's precision weighted. What about in patients? Again, in controls, in green, in at-risk mental states, it's not so, it's very precision weighted in controls, intermediate in at-risk mental states, and the precision weighting is completely gone in the patients with psychosis. And there's a relationship to positive symptoms. There's a weak relationship with positive symptoms as well. So the patients who have more precision weighting have less positive symptoms. Okay, so we have seen evidence in abnormalities in the way that very simple decisions that we're doing in the lab, very simple beliefs about trivial things, but it's a way of studying it in experimentally rigorous ways. Abnormalities in psychosis. We see there's a role for dopamine. Of course, there may be many other neurotransmitters as well. We need to do many more studies before this can be translated to the clinic. I mean, I do sometimes talk about this expectations and illusions with my patients, and I might even recommend smart patients, if they're interested, to read a very good book by Chris Frith about these phenomenon. But I think we want to see more, if we want to see some throughput into the clinic. One interesting area is many of these paradigms you can do in rodents now. So once you can do them in rodents, you can make genetic manipulations, you can do drug manipulations, and maybe we'll get some new paradigms into our drug discovery, and not the same paradigms that we've used for many, many years. So, yep, we've discussed the brain as a predictive engine, looked at how predictive processing may be faulty in psychosis, and thought about how, theoretical models, very interesting theoretical models can be studied, although, of course, it makes it very simplistic when we take it to an experiment, but we need that to make it rigorous. And yeah, you can do human preclinical experiments and indeed animal preclinical experiments as well. Thank you very much for colleagues and Hugh for your attention.
Wonderful. You gave us 5 minutes to answer some questions, and I would like to start really, asking you and trigger the philosopher in yourself. Really, you heard Thomas talking. To what extent is what you're doing and showing us a totally different kind of way of unpicking delusions, or is there any way to reconcile this with the conceptual understanding, really, from a phenomenological perspective?
So one thing that I didn't talk about was how things change over time. So of course, in Thomas's presentation was that very interesting longitudinal aspect, which is of course very important as people become unwell. And so Carl Friston and Rick Adams and colleagues, they have put forward a theory to see how this predictive coding changes over time, and how you might start with weak priors, for example, for sensory information, maybe early on. And then what do you do with that? Your brain may compensate, and you may have to compensate for your weak priors on sensory information with some strong cognitive priors, higher level. And then over time, you may get this compensation and adaptation, which can be resolved with a delusion. Now, they've postulated that, and of course, people have barely done the cross-sectional studies, never mind the longitudinal. But it is an avenue that you can take, you could experimentally at least take this framework and look at it longitudinally to see how these different priors at different levels change and may be resolved and may change with symptoms as they come and go. So it's not exactly the same, but we can take something from it.
So you want to add something to that, Thomas? Or?
Yeah, well, it would be interesting to see how. Sorry, I agree. It would be very interesting to see how the delusion itself, which is usually kicking in quite abruptly, how it changes the predictive processing, well, the predictive processes, and why exactly delusion reduces the uncertainty, surprise, the inattention, and creates something like a new certainty. So in terms of speaking of the brain in a bit anthropomorphic way, the brain seems to be more at ease with this delusional conviction with regard to the changed sensory or sensory motor input. And it would be interesting if that is somehow if this can be pictured in the neurobiological paradigm. So why does delusion change and shift the experience?
Yeah, so I mean, Friston really says that the purpose of any organism is to minimize its prediction error, and you want to be that's the most adaptive state, is to be always trying to minimize your prediction error. So indeed, yeah, delusion, because of its incredible explanatory power, can explain away so many otherwise incredibly surprising and perplexing phenomena. So yeah, that would be the suggestion, but of course it would need some empirical testing.
Yeah, there is no there are no studies about you said the longitudinal question of how it changes with the onset of delusion.
Yes,
so that's not yet.
I can show you one, because we did one. So we can look at this one. Okay, yeah. So Adams, I skipped over this because we didn't have much time. Okay. Adams proposed, initially weak priors on sensory data. Then over time, the brain starts to overweight the cognitive higher level priors, and they help resolve the surprise. So we did try and test it, not longitudinally, but we did what you do when you can't wait for the longitudinal. You take the patients in the prodromal state and the patients in the first episode state. So a sort of quasi-longitudinal study. And we did a task called the McGurk task, which is about expectations and perceptions. Okay, and we found that we had two different kinds of prior, a sensory prior and a cognitive prior. And we found, as predicted, that the patients in the very early stages had these weak sensory priors. And we did find, as expected, that the patients with the frank psychosis had the strong cognitive priors. So we should really do one following over time, but we found some evidence for Adams's hypothesis there.
Yeah. Right. I think in the interest of our speakers, we should close on time. Really, thank you very much again, really, for coming along. Thanks to you as well for staying up to the end. We had an audience online, about 150 people as well. So I think it was well received. Thank you very much.
Thanks.